30 years after, I must say, I still find that I didn't know everything. Surprising, yeah? That I discover facts, like, for example, that I didn't know when I was very close to all this process, and that, in a way, it's not surprising, because when you're engaged in an activity like the ones that we're talking about, there are many people that are involved. There's the Prime Minister, his cabinet, his ministers, there are officials, there are provincial officials. There are all kinds of discussions that are going on, and that result in, perhaps sometimes, with a product. And this time we had the amendment of 1982. I've accepted to talk about the drafting of the end product, how it occurred. It didn't happen as a spontaneous generation. We were lucky to have a lot of sources that we could draw on for the drafting of the papers that were presented in the conference of the summer. But my thesis is that there was not one drafter. There were many drafters. There were many drafters in the Department of Justice, and there were many drafters outside the department. And I will show you that I will support this thesis by looking at different points in the processes. The processes started after May 20th, the May 20th referendum on the Quebec sovereignty. But I should say before that a few days after the federal election of 1980, Mr. Chrétien phoned me, and he says, I had known him because I had taught him some law and administration of justice and when in his first years in Ottawa as an MP, and he said, I would like to see you. So I came along as a faithful civil servant to see him. And he said, Roger, I want to tell you that I will be sworn in this afternoon as Minister of Justice. And I want to tell you how I will run the business. I am the minister. I'm dealing with the politics of things. You are the deputy, and you administer the department. I want your memo to be short, and I want you to know everything that will be presented to me for my signature, because if I sign a letter without reading it, if there's a comeback, your head is on the block. So, okay, that was fair ball. I had no intention of getting involved in politics anyway, but I was reassured that he didn't tell me that you won't be involved in the policies. In French, there's very important differences between the two words. Anyway, after the referendum in Quebec, the Prime Minister invited his colleagues to meet with him in the fall, the famous September conference that almost everybody has talked about since the beginning of this conference. But before, there had to be some meetings of ministers guided by officials, and there were 12 items on the agenda. The Prime Minister had said everything is open, except two things. We live and will continue to live in a federal regime, and the Charter of Rights is key, and particularly official languages rights. So there were 12 items, and there were drafts that were prepared. And I think we were lucky in terms of the Charter, because the Prime Minister himself had tabled C-60 in 1979. He had been involved in the 1979, obviously, discussion with his colleagues in the Constitution just before the election. So we had, and we had a lot of other drafts and other documents that we could call upon. The BC, the US bills of rights, and so on and so forth. So we had some documents that we could rely on to draft the first documents that were tabled before the ministers' conference. And during the summer, I think I agree with, at least with that, what Roy Romano has said, that this was the time to build trust between the officials, between the ministers, it was very exciting to work during that summer with the people that were involved in this process. And much progress has been made in terms of the other items, other than the charter. There have been a lot of progress made, and particularly there were 3 committees I was very much involved personally as co-chair in the Supreme Court of Canada on the divorce and judicial system and the charter. And on the three committee, I was working with members of the Provincial Department of Justice, if not the DMs themselves. We had known them ourselves for about 7-8 years, because of my involvement in this as Deputy Solicitor General, responsible for penal reform, and also in the Department of Justice itself. So we had a lot of, I must say, I was excited, I had a lot of fun working on these items, and we made a good deal of progress, I should say, except for the charter. Because so far as the charter was concerned, this was a very, very controversial issue. The Prime Minister wanted to have an entrenched charter. The provinces didn't want to have an entrenched charter. It was very difficult to get the provinces engaged in the text of the charter. Anyway, the September conference was a disaster. It didn't work at all. It was complete disagreement. And it was not possible because of the progress that had been made. You know, the progress was still very, very disparate and diverse. Some provinces agreed with the other provinces. The federal government agreed with some provinces, not with the others. So it was all over the place, and time was pressing. And the Prime Minister had to decide what to do. He decided, in his wisdom, that he would proceed unilaterally. October the 2nd, he proposed an unilateral resolution that he said would be put to the Joint Committee. It's true there was a plan, a kind of a plan, because he said, I want this report from the Joint Committee not later than December the 2nd. And there won't be any television involved in this or radio diffusion, broadcasting of the proceedings. But because of the opposition, Mr. Clark won his case, that there should be a longer period, that it should be televised. Quite frankly, I think that what saved the process for Mr. Trudeau and for us, because in effect, without that, quite frankly, I don't think that we would be here celebrating the charter that we have now. I think that I was so pleased to see the video this morning that, in effect, people in Canada decided to discuss whether we have a charter or not and what the charter should be. The provinces didn't want to do that in the summer, but they themselves seized the opportunity to talk about all the rights that we know are incorporated in the charter. And that changed completely the charter itself, because the charter we had proposed, with Mr. Trudeau's knowledge, obviously, and his willingness to proceed on that basis, although it had been amended slightly after the September meeting to try to facilitate the support that we hope we could get from Ontario and other provinces, it was a very, I'd say now, knowing what happened afterwards, and comparing to what we have, was a weak charter. It fundamentally changed the charter in many, many respects. In respect to Section 1, and the provinces, by the way, responding to one of the questions that was raised of I was about to say Mr. Maroney, not Mr. Maroney, but Mr. Romano, that what about Section 1? Well, this was not discussed during the summer. It happened after the meeting and the report of the Joint Committee. Section 1, Section 15, the enforcement section, Section 52, all of these sections were the result of representations that were made to the committee. What was really quite astounding was why, having run all of this way, that far, after the meetings of the Joint Committee, the government very readily said, yes, we should do all of that. We didn't have any problem in the Department of Justice trying to persuade the ministers that they should, or the Prime Minister, that there should be amendments, serious amendments that would reinforce the Charter. They accepted it. I think they realized very clearly that they had a winner in their hands, because the Canadian public wanted to have a Charter. They wanted to have a Cadillac, not a Volkswagen. And then they sailed with it. I think that's why I say there was not much discussion in the Joint Committee about the other aspect that was put in the amending formula, about some discussions about the referendum. If there was a disagreement with some provinces, they wanted to put to the public their own version of what a charter should look like or what the amending formula should look like. This was not very much discussed. The Canadian had really said, we want a charter. The government said, we'll buy that. Now, I jump to, how much time do I still have?
About 2 minutes.
About 2 minutes? Yeah, okay, 2 minutes. I would have liked to comment on some of the points that were made about...
You get the last word, Roger.
I get the last word? Okay. I will keep it for the last word. I think that there were other important moments that occurred. After the Supreme Court decision was rendered and some prompting from some provincial ministers, there was a meeting, another meeting. The meeting we're celebrating today. And many mentioned that at one time, on the third day, I think it was, there was an exchange on the question of referendum between Mr. Lévesque and Mr. Trudeau. And after that exchange in the morning, I remember very well, the Prime Minister Trudeau came out of the meeting and said, great news. We have an accord between Ottawa and Quebec. And we went, a few of us, to 24 Success with him, and we discussed that. So I won't have time to see what we discussed. And after the meeting, I came back and had been tasked to explain to the media how the referendum proposal of Mr. Trudeau would work. Explained that, came back to the meeting, and Mr. Lévesque said, well, that's not what I understood. That's not really what I had in mind. There was some further discussion between the First Ministers. At the end of the day, we all look, where is this all going? It doesn't look like it's going anywhere. I went to see Mary and said, Mary, I think just in case, you should draft, the proposal that the Prime Minister had in mind, had made to the meeting. We didn't have a draft at that point, so she started working with her colleagues on the draft. After the end of the meeting, the Prime Minister called a meeting of ministers, a few officials, at 24 Sussex. And Mr. Chrétien explained the discussion he had with some premier, the two Roys, no perhaps others, and that he was persuaded that, well, we still stand a chance of getting a deal. The Prime Minister was not at all in agreement with what Chrétien was saying. He preferred the referendum because for him the referendum, a national referendum, would clearly establish the authority of Parliament to deal with certain matters for all Canadians. Anyway, he said at the end of that meeting, well, Jean, if you think that you can rally a substantial number of provinces, I might go for it. I went home. Chrétien did the work. The next morning, I come to the meeting, to the conference center to meet with him about 8 o'clock and see him there. And he says, well, I think, Roger, we have a deal. Oh, yeah, well, how does it work? He explained to me what it worked essentially what Roy Romano was saying. I said, what about the notwithstanding formula? Will there be any conditions? Oh, yes, don't worry. There won't. The Prime Minister will raise the question at the plenary, and there will be conditions. Okay. I run to Mary, to see Mary, and say, Mary, I think we have a deal. That was the first time she heard about it. So I said, you need to start drafting a revised version that would incorporate these changes. Okay, so we went to the meeting, and I will just skip some of the details. And the First Ministers discussed, Brian Peckford presented what the deal might be, and there was some discussions. At one very important point, I will skip some of the details. Notwithstanding clause, I mean, it's what we have now. It was accepted by Mr. Loughy and other premiers. And there was, with respect to the language rights, minority education language rights, the Prime Minister said, okay, all of the English-speaking Canadian provinces are agreed that they will opt in the section. And he turned to Mr. Levesque and said, how about you, Mr. Levesque? Are you prepared to opt in? I said, no damn way. He didn't say damn, but I said, I think it was the equivalent. That, because I think it was serious. He said, well, he believed that this would create a revolution in the street of Montreal and so on and so forth. He mentioned 3 objections why you would not sign on the deal. One asked about the amending formula, the lack of financial support for those provinces that will not agree to a transfer of responsibilities from the provinces to Ottawa. The language rights, he still had objections, and mobility rights, he had some objections as well. So the other premiers said, and I think that's really the point I wanted to come to, the other premier said, well, we are not to be part of the imposition on Quebec of these rights. We don't want anybody to say that we agreed. So you, Mr. Levesque, and Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Levesque, you may want to discuss it, you may deal with it, and try to see what kind of arrangement you can make, but we're not party to an imposition of Section 23. So I could go on a little bit further.
Well, maybe we'll save a little bit of that for the end, Roger, because Mary has been sitting drafting all this time. Yeah. And maybe we should give her an opportunity to say a word or two, and then Barry, and then you can do the finale. Okay, Mary? Yeah.
Well, I think I'll save my remarks till after Barry's spoken, and I'll.
Would you rather do that?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
I got it backwards. Okay, Barry?
Okay. I have a lot of things I'd like to say and not much time to say them. I wouldn't claim to be a drafter. Mary's the drafter, and drafters are pretty jealous of their positions, and they don't fancy suggestions from amateurs as to what they should put on a piece of paper. I have a great respect for drafters, but I guess I would fall into the category of advisor, and I was an advisor for a long time on the development of the Patriation and the Charter. I went to my first constitutional conference with the Saskatchewan delegation 51 years ago. That was in 1960, and I went to every conference after that except one until 1983, I think. So this is a range of my experience. I didn't have the pleasure, as Roger and Mary did, of being associated with Meech Lake or Charlottetown. I was on the bench by that time. The only thing I had to do with it was a group of First Nations people asked me to issue an injunction against the referendum to enjoin Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Clark, stopping them from having this referendum. I declined. It seems to me that advisors on the question of patriation had 2 tasks. One was to help devise a formula for an Canadian amending procedure, and the other was to advise on how the Constitution could be brought home to Canada in a way which would make it politically, or would make it legitimate in the eyes of most Canadians. And there are 2 aspects of that, which I'll talk about later. You know some of the history of the attempts at an amending formula going back to 1927. I won't reiterate that. If you look at the various developments in the 20s, 30s, 50s, 60s, there are common elements in all of these formulae, which usually involved the agents for change being Parliament and the legislatures of the province. The Constitution was divided into categories. Some kinds of changes some kinds of sections would require unanimity of the provinces, others would not. The formula that was adopted in 1982 really has all those elements in it. And even the idea of opting out, it was not novel in 1982. It was suggested by a committee of attorneys general in 1936, but of course there was no agreement. Anyway, I don't think I need to say more about the formula which was adopted. I guess the other point I might make was that the only exception from the features that we saw in these various formulae over the years was the Victoria formula, which was different because it had no categories which required unanimous consent of the provinces, and the consent of the provinces was to be expressed regionally, based on the model of the Senate, which has different regional districts. And the formula would require the agreement of four regions, the four regions, which included the Western provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces. And if two or more in the Western provinces and two or more in the Atlantic agreed, and if Ontario and Quebec agreed, then the amendment could be made. That also was put forward in our resolution in Parliament in September of 1980, at least something on the same principles. The other issue I started working on in about 1970, and that was the question of legitimacy. At that time, I was in charge of a unit in the Cabinet Office, the Privy Council Office, and I did a think piece for the Cabinet on legitimacy and how this might be achieved. I explained that there can be legal legitimacy, there can be political legitimacy, and you should have at least one of those. It's best to have both. In that time, in 1970, we were having a special issue as to whether we would go to Westminster for them to enact our new Constitution. This had been the assumption all the way along in the previous attempts at patriation. But in 1970, we were getting signals from the province of Quebec that they did not want to have a constitution enacted by a foreign power. And so we were trying to see how we might finesse this. At that time, we were optimistic, and we thought we would have unanimous agreement of all governments to the Victoria Charter, which we were working on at that point. And so we assumed we'd have what would be probably pretty well perfect political legitimacy if we had all legislatures and Parliament on side. But we're trying to find a way not to have Westminster enact it. And I went to London with John Turner in 1971 early, and we discussed with the Brits how to do this. We suggested that they not enact our new constitution, which we called the Victoria Charter, but that they simply recognize it as being valid. And we worked out a deal where they were going to pass a short act called the Canada Act, which would sort of tidy up their statutes and would recognize the validity of the Victoria Charter as a new constitution. Well, we came back to Canada and discussed that with the provincial governments. They were in accord, and this was the assumption on which we were moving forward with the Victoria Charter. If that had gone through, if there had been perfect agreement on the Victoria Charter, this would have given us, I think, about as politically legitimate constitution as we could hope for. But there would be some doubts about the legal legitimacy of it, because legal legitimacy normally requires that a constitution be enacted or adopted by the body which had authority, previously had authority to legislate for a constitution. For example, the first U.S. Constitution was not legally legitimate, but nevertheless they've got along with it. Not very well sometimes, but they get along with it. In 1980, of course, it was a different problem. We thought we can't take any risks about legal legitimacy here. There may be some problems about how much agreement we've got by the time we want to go to Westminster. Hope to get unanimity, of course, but we're looking at all alternatives. And so we didn't hold back on legal legitimacy. It was done in the conventional way with a statute adopted by Parliament. And the whole argument about the conventions of the Constitution, all really was an argument over the legitimacy of a new Constitution, which would be legal, but would it be in accordance with constitutional conventions. In the famous Kirby Memorandum, we advised and this is not a secret because various people leaked the Kirby Memorandum and it had been made a public document, and the legal advice is there to be seen. The government asked us about the feasibility of moving ahead, even if we didn't get unanimous agreement, and we advised that there was very little doubt about the legal legitimacy of a constitution adopted by Westminster, but we advised against referring the issue to the Supreme Court. On the legal side, we thought there was no need, and on the side of conventions, we said it's not an appropriate matter for the Supreme Court. It's a political question, but we cautioned some province or provinces could get this to the Supreme Court if they referred the question about the conventions to their Court of Appeal, and then they could appeal that decision to the Supreme Court. Since our memorandum was leaked, it became a sort of how-to-do-it manual for the Gang of Eight. I'll now talk about the Charter. There was, of course, renewed interest in Canada after the war about the Charter, about human rights, and yet there was not a political will at that time to have a constitutional charter. The dominant political view during the 40s and 50s was that the supremacy of Parliament, or legislative supremacy, must not be tinkered with, and therefore they did not want to adopt any principles which would be constitutional in nature and which could be enforced by the courts against the governments. And the Liberals were quite consistent in this opposition to an entrenched Bill of Rights. However, in 1960, when Mr. Diefenbaker put forward his statutory Bill of Rights, Mr. Pearson suddenly embraced the idea of a constitutional Bill of Rights because that was not what Mr. Diefenbaker was proposing. And and of course, in the years that followed, there was quite a bit of disappointment about the statutory bill. I was, well, in 1967, it looked as if Canada should be talking about its constitution, patriation, and otherwise. I was hired on contract from the University of Saskatchewan to come to Ottawa for the summer of '67, and I worked with Mr. Trudeau, who had just become Minister of Justice, and his principal constitutional counsel was Carl Goldenberg, and I was put on as associate counsel, and under Carl's direction, I was put to work writing a think piece, a discussion paper about a Charter of Rights for Canadians. As we know, Mr. Trudeau had intellectually been attached to the idea of a charter for some years and had written about it. But now he saw it as increasingly interesting for strategic reasons. The provinces are already wanting to talk about the distribution of powers, and the Confederation of Tomorrow conference was scheduled and so forth. And Trudeau wanted to recommend to the federal cabinet that they agree to constitutional conferences with the first item being a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights. In the course of that summer, I wrote this book, which you've probably all seen. I'm afraid I can't recommend you buy it because I think it's out of print, but Mr. Trudeau used it. I think he used it in his leadership campaign later on. I didn't know he had that in mind. Anyway, so I sat down and sort of sketched out the issues that would have to be addressed, what rights you put in it, what limitations you might allow on rights, and whether there should be an overriding clause like there was for the Canadian Bill of Rights, where it could where the War Measures Act could override it in times of emergency. And we talked about the problems of due process and how we should avoid the dangers that the United States had encountered, or at least the problems where in the United States due process had been interpreted by the Supreme Court to include a substantive due process, meaning that the Supreme Court could pass judgment on the wisdom of the legislation or the policies of the legislation, not just guarantee fair procedures, but could also second-guess Congress or state legislatures on whether this was a good piece of legislation. And we wanted to avoid that, and to make a long story short, that's why principles of fundamental justice was eventually put in Section 7 to avoid due process. And Roger and I testified to the Parliamentary Committee what that meant, but we didn't convince the Supreme Court in 1985 in a Highway Act reference. The Supreme Court said that principles of fundamental justice really connoted the same thing as due process, substantive due process, that they could judge whether an act was a good law, fair, I guess, consistent with our principles of justice. And Mr. Justice Lemaire, who wrote the judgment, he quoted what Roger and I had told the committee, which of course he didn't agree with, and he said, but the views of public servants, howsoever distinguished, cannot be determinative. So he let us down easily. There was one question, if I can just take time, there was a question raised about Section 1 and the limitation section. Initially, when we were putting together the charter, this goes back to the 1970s, we wrote in different limitations for different rights. And I think we were being influenced by the European Convention on Human Rights, principally, but then also the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Well, a draft of this was published in 1980, in the summer of 1980, and we were particularly condemned by Lise Bissonnette of Le Devoir, who said that we had so many exceptions that they almost destroyed the rights, all these possibilities of different grounds for limiting this right or that right, public health, public safety, defense of the realm, and so forth. So we came back to a single section, and it was very much the way it is today. The provinces finally came up with a proposed Bill of Rights in August of 1980. They didn't agree with the principle. They said they didn't agree with entrenchment, but they presented this draft in case there should be entrenchment. Well, it had a limitation section which was like ours is today, except it was they wanted to add after a free and democratic society with a parliamentary system of government. And we thought, well, maybe that's something we could sell. And as Roger says, when we went into the process in October of putting forward a resolution, we were looking for ways to try to gain more provincial support. And we knew what various provinces had to say. At that time, we were trying to get support from provinces other than Ontario and New Brunswick. And so we put in this provincial formulation. Well, once the Parliamentary Committee got to work, human rights groups roundly condemned it and said that you're really just saying with a parliamentary system of government, it means that a parliamentary system of parliamentary supremacy, it means that you can always vote to limit rights as long as it's done in Parliament or done by legislature. So we had to revert to the formulation which is in there today, free and democratic society.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mary Dawson.
Thank you. Well, I only became involved in this exercise in September of 1980. And really up until the November exercise that we're commemorating now, I wasn't super pressed, shall I say. I had minor adjustments to make before the resolution was tabled in October. But where I did quite a bit of work was while the the draft was in front of the Joint Parliamentary Committee because, you know, I pulled out the document that we tabled in February 1981, and it's astonishing to see the number of changes that were made. It just makes the point about how much was done at that Standing Joint Committee. Almost every section of the Charter was strengthened. There was sections added. And I was in the back room receiving drafts that people had proposed, or in a few cases drafting them originally myself for this parcel. So that I was pretty busy through that period. But I'm going to skip right forward to the November conference because we don't have a lot of time. So at the November conference, of course, the details of the Charter were not at issue, but whether we should have a Charter at all. And I had been asked to go over to the conference center on November the 3rd to wait for stuff to happen, and I would then draft whatever to accommodate whatever had happened. Well, it got pretty boring. I was up on the 5th floor of the conference center, waiting and waiting and waiting. Got to the point where I phoned back to my office and I said, listen, send some other files off here. I'm going crazy. But anyway, all that ended on November the 4th when I was called over to Roger's office to learn about the Levesque. I had no, of course, there was no television in the room or anything at that point, so I had no idea what was going on downstairs. So anyway, the end of the day on end of the afternoon on November the 4th, I was called over to Roger's office, and he said, well, we have this deal with Levesque. I was pretty surprised, but I took it, and he said, could you please work on this, and we'll have a meeting tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. So off I went back to my office in the Justice Building and started work. I don't even think I can't remember if I had supper that night or not, but I must have stopped and picked something up to eat. Roger and not Roger, but Barry Strayer and Fred Jordan came over to join me. But I think they went for supper first because I needed a couple of hours to kind of get the thing started together in any event.
I brought you something.
Did you? I can't remember. Anyway, and of course the other person with me was Gerard Bertrand, who was the French drafter. It's interesting, we had contingency drafts of referenda provisions for the Charter that didn't differ that much from the draft that we were to prepare, except that they didn't exclude the language provisions. But we had no draft for that referendum with respect to the amending formula. So that's what took us most of the night. I finished the English version about 4 o'clock in the morning. Incidentally, Fred and Barry kind of vanished around midnight. But anyway, I kept on. And I finished about 4 in the morning, but I waited for a while to see how Gerard was doing on the French. He of course, we were sort of going back and forth through that time. He didn't finish his French, I don't think, till, I left at 6. And he was still putting the finishing touches on his French version, 6 a.m. Once I got home, I had this meeting with Roger at 8 in the morning. So I took a shower, had some breakfast, and then headed back for Roger's office, proudly carrying my new draft with the referendum, double referendum, I called it. We were greeted by Roger on the morning of November the 5th and informed that the new draft wasn't needed because another deal had been agreed to overnight based on the kitchen accord. We were briefed on the changes and then headed immediately over to the 5th floor rooms in the conference center around 9 a.m. with our secretaries to produce our new draft. Interestingly, I was interested to see that handwritten kitchen accord that Roy Romano showed. Somewhere along the line in the middle of the night, somebody typed it up because I have a draft, typed a draft of all these provisions. So don't know when that happened. Anyway, just running quickly through the components of the kitchen accord. So I don't know if we've gone through it. the amending formula was to be the April Accord of the Gang of Eight, and of course that was the biggest job that I had. Section 55 was dropped. Then there was a number of provisions changed in the Charter, 3 of them actually, adding to Section 6 on mobility rights. The notwithstanding clause was to be added with the 5-year limitation. The 23 minority language education rights were to apply to all provinces. And the provision for the Constitutional Conference for the Aboriginal Peoples of Canada was to be included. And then as well, the provincial people had agreed to leave the equalization and regional disparities provision and the resources. Now, I've wondered for a whole bunch of years why nobody let me know that the Levesque deal was off, and I could go home early and get some sleep before I tackled the real job. But I've sort of osmosed gradually an understanding that this thing was negotiated all night effectively. So that's how it happened, and we had to be prepared. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about the drafting process itself. In 1981, we were still using typewriters. Our drafts were prepared on legal-size paper, and when we adjusted our drafts, our secretaries prepared strips of paper that, when we adjusted our drafts, they just stuck them on to the appropriate spot in the page. And sometimes the pages got quite thick. Until we couldn't work on them anymore, and then we would just simply have her type up a new page, and then we'd start over again. We photocopied. Our method of reproduction was only photocopying. Now, a few years later, we moved to computers, but not until after the Aboriginal Constitutional Amendment in '83. I should also mention that we always had a whole bunch of what we called hip pocket drafts, covering a number of possible policy changes in case we were suddenly faced with a change. So when we inserted the Kitchen Accord, we worked on the changes all morning, as I said. No, I didn't say that. But we worked on it all morning, and we were totally oblivious, again, to what was going on downstairs with the First Ministers. So most of our time, as I said, was spent on the new amending formula. We'd understood that the provincial proposal would never be accepted. We asked a number of times through that 6-month period, shouldn't we be looking at that thing? Always told, no, there's just no way that one is going to be accepted. And so we spent, as I say, most of the morning toning up that draft. That we did make a number of changes. I did make a number of changes. I had, there's a picture actually that Barry and I both have a copy of with myself on one side of the table and Barry and Fred on the other. And it was rather frustrating because as a drafter I had nobody, well, I had Barry and Fred, but I didn't have anybody who'd made that proposal to communicate with about what the heck they meant in certain instances. And the area that gave me the most difficulty was the Supreme Court. And to this day, there's some confusion as to just exactly the import of that Supreme Court. And I said, well, I don't know. Finally, we said, well, we'll just put the words in that are there and hope for the best. But it was evident there that it wasn't all that clear. Now, the next thing that happened was when we finally got the draft ready. It took us till about noon. And I think that was about the time, I lose track of the time a little bit, but I think that was about the time they were all rejoicing and signing the agreement and everything. And it was agreed that some of the ministers would meet on the 4th floor to look at the draft through the afternoon. Once it was completed, we copied it and distributed it for those afternoon discussions. They were on the 4th floor. There was an office up on the 4th floor, a round table that the ministers and I think very small number of advisors with them. And it was connected by a stairway to the 5th floor where we were huddled. But actually, I came down and joined them on the 4th floor to explain anything that they wanted about the draft. And the discussions went on through the afternoon, and a number of changes were made, largely technical. My recollection is that this was all finished around 5 o'clock, and I think Barry's got a different. I remember a pandemonium around that photocopy machine trying to get everybody was trying to get their copy so they could catch their plane home. So off they went. Now, this wasn't the end of the process. In the several weeks that followed the conference, the participants were invited to contact the feds, and there was lots of discussions that went on. We've heard a bit about that through the day. Basically, the last-minute changes that were made to the package after the deal was struck were a new Section 40 was added to the amending procedures for compensation for the provinces opting out. The mother tongue test for rights to minority language schooling was removed for Quebec, still with the hopes that Quebec would somehow join us. The Aboriginal rights provisions went back in, and Section 28 was removed from the notwithstanding clause.